The BBC has found itself, once again, engulfed in crisis. The row started last week when The Telegraph reported on a leaked memo, which outlined a number of instances where the BBC had failed its duty of impartiality. The most significant claim surrounded an episode of the news programme Panorama, in which a speech from Donald Trump was edited together in order to make it look like he urged a crowd to go down to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell, when in reality the statement had been spliced together from two different parts of the speech. The fallout from the leaking of this memo has been severe, with the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, and the head of BBC News, Deborah Turners, resigning over it. So in this video, we're going to take a look into the current situation, starting with the crisis itself, before discussing what the BBC could do next. The next issue of our magazine, Too Long, is coming out soon, with this issue focusing on realignment in the Middle East, discussing how recent events fundamentally reshape the region. Pre-order your copy or subscribe by clicking the link in the description. Now, this whole saga began last Tuesday, when The Telegraph published an article on its front page titled BBC's Trump Bias Exposed in a Memo Leak. The article referred to an internal whistleblowing memo written by Michael Prescott, a former external advisor to the BBC's Editorial Standards Committee, which detailed a number of complaints about the BBC's impartiality. These included claims that the BBC fell too easily for putting out ill-researched material that suggested issues of racism when there were none. The LGBTQ desk staffers would decline to cover any story raising difficult questions about the trans debate, that too many of the BBC's staff had never considered the idea of gender identity to be either spurious or offensive to many people, that the BBC has faced and still faces considerable criticism from the Jewish community and from cross-party parliamentarians across both houses over its record in reporting the conflict in Gaza, and in particular the coverage of BBC Arabic, and that a Panorama episode from the end of October in 2024 created the impression that Trump had said something he did not. It's this latter claim that caused the most controversy though. Specifically, that a Panorama episode made it sound like Trump said, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be with you, and we fight. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Now, what Trump actually said was, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol and I'll be with you. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." The part about fighting like hell was actually said 54 minutes later. By the end of last week, the pressure had built up sufficiently that both Tim Davie, the head of the BBC, and the head of BBC News, Deborah Turners, felt that they had to quit. Responding to this, Trump celebrated Davie's resignation on Truth Social, and had, on Monday, said that he would sue the BBC for a nice round sum of $1 billion. Now, virtually everyone seems to think that the Panorama edit was a mistake. Politicians from all sides have come out against it, and Turners had reportedly written a letter accepting that there was a mistake, and that there should have been some kind of flash or wipe that would make it clear that the statement was from two different parts of the speech. But this has become even more difficult for the BBC for three reasons. First, at least some people think the BBC overreacted. Even if you think the Panorama edit was egregious, the simultaneous resignation of perhaps the BBC's two biggest honchos is unprecedented, and there's a risk that this invites more editorial pressure from Trump in the future. Second, the Panorama edit, and the other examples mentioned in Michael Prescott's memo, have restarted a long-running debate about the BBC's impartiality. Now, this is a can of worms we're not going to open now, but we think it's worth at least noting that while the Panorama edit has fueled accusation of leftwards bias from the right, the BBC is also frequently accused of rightwards bias by the British left. According to a YouGov poll from September, for instance, 25% of Brits believe that the BBC is favourable to Labour and or the left, while 17% think that the BBC is favourable to the Conservatives and or the right. And thirdly, this has exposed some pretty stark internal divisions within the BBC. As we mentioned earlier, Turners had an apology ready to publish early last week, a move that would have prevented a media black hole, and would have set the BBC up to defend itself against accusations of institutional bias. This black hole was eventually filled by further reports from The Telegraph, and statements from the White House attacking it further. According to reports, it was the BBC board that blocked this apology, the first move in what some are describing as a coup. This coup seems to have been aided by certain individual board members at the BBC, most notably Robbie Gibb. Now, Gibb was appointed to the board in 2021 by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, having previously served as communications chief for Theresa May. Since then, he's reportedly been attempting to get rid of what he sees as liberal bias at the BBC. Allies of Gibb have framed this as an attempt to save the BBC from itself, but given his background as a Tory appointee, some view this as more of an ideological crusade of its own. Last week, Gibb reportedly led the charge against the BBC in 2 separate meetings, amplifying the criticisms, namely that there was liberal bias at the BBC made by Michael Prescott, reportedly a friend of Gibb, in his memo. And this pressure was ultimately fundamental in pushing both Davey and Turness out. Now, it's quite possible that there wasn't a coordinated effort to push senior members of the BBC out, but given the individuals involved and their previous statements on BBC bias, it's not hard to see why some believe that there might have been a coup. Either way though, coup or no coup, this whole scandal seems to have come at the worst possible time for the BBC. With charter renewal scheduled for 2027, the government is currently evaluating exactly how the BBC receives its funding and what its purpose should be. Those on the right, who tend to believe that the organisation should receive less money from taxpayers and should be smaller, have just been emboldened by this. At a time when the BBC is leaderless and recovering from scandal, these negotiations are the last thing it needs. By now, you've probably heard all about this story online, but depending on where you read about it, you might have heard a completely different side of the story. So, how are you supposed to know what's real and what's being fabricated by one side or the other? Well, this week we're lucky enough to be sponsored by Ground News, who are the experts in helping you rethink how you consume media online. Their website and app collects thousands of articles, putting them all in one easy-to-access place to help expose outlets' political bias, how relying their reporting practices are, and who owns them, with all of their information backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And whenever we're faced with a nuanced story, we just head straight to Ground News to get the breakdown on everything we need to understand it better. For example, if we wanted to learn more about the legal threats against the BBC from Donald Trump, we would just need to take a look at Ground News to see that 381 sources are reporting on it, with most of that coverage coming from the centre. Of those reporting, the left frame it as a row or scandal, while the right celebrate Trump, quote, bringing down executives. You can see quickly who owns the outlets behind each story, and that context matters. Once you start noticing how independent sources frame things differently than massive conglomerates, it changes how you read the news. We've even used it to filter out corporate-owned media when we want a wider mix of voices or hone in on the highest-rated factual outlets. It's one of the few tools that actually helps you shape your media diet, not the algorithm. You know it's no secret just how much we appreciate Ground News. Having such an incredible tool to help us stay fully informed and aware of political bias is a game changer in today's media landscape. And as such, we partner with them to offer TLDR viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description or go to ground.news/TLDR or even scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.